The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is the head of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister and Cabinet collectively accountable for their policies and actions to the monarch, to Parliament, to the political party and ultimately to the electorate. The current Prime Minister, Theresa May, leader of the Conservative Party, was appointed by the Queen on 13 July 2016. The office is not established by any constitutional law but exists only by a long-established convention, which stipulates that the monarch must appoint as Prime Minister the person most likely to command the confidence of the House of Commons. This individual is typically the leader of the political party, a coalition of parties that holds the largest number of seats in that chamber. The position of Prime Minister was not created, it evolved slowly and erratically over 300 years due to numerous acts of Parliament, political developments, and accidents of history. The office is therefore best understood from a historical perspective. The origins of the position are found in constitutional changes that occurred during the revolutionary settlement and the resulting shift of political power from the sovereign to Parliament. Although the sovereign was not stripped of the ancient prerogative powers and legally remained the head of government, politically it gradually became necessary for him or her to govern through Prime Minister who could command a majority in Parliament. By the 1830s the Westminster system of government had emerged. The Prime Minister had become primus inter pares of the first among equals in the Cabinet and the head of government in the United Kingdom. The political position of Prime Minister was enhanced by the development of modern political parties, the introduction of mass communication, and photography. By the start of the 20th century the modern premiership had emerged. The office had become the preeminent position in the constitutional hierarchy, vis-à-vis the sovereign, Parliament and Cabinet. Prior to 1902, the Prime Minister sometimes came from the House of Lords, provided that his government could form a majority in the Commons. However, as the power of the aristocracy waned during the 19th century, the convention developed that the Prime Minister should always sit in the lower house. As leader of the House of Commons, the Prime Minister's authority was further enhanced by the Parliament Act of 1911, which marginalized the influence of the House of Lords in the lawmaking process. The Prime Minister is ex officio also First Lord of the Treasury and Minister for the Civil Service. Certain privileges, such as residency of 10 Downing Street, are accorded to Prime Ministers by virtue of the position as First Lord of the Treasury. Authority. As the head of Her Majesty's government, the modern Prime Minister leads the Cabinet. In addition, the Prime Minister leads a major political party and generally commands a majority in the House of Commons. As such, the incumbent wields both legislative and executive powers. Under the British system there is a unity of powers rather than separation. In the House of Commons, the Prime Minister guides the lawmaking process with the goal of enacting the legislative agenda of the political party. In an executive capacity, the Prime Minister appoints all other cabinet members and ministers, and coordinates the policies and activities of all government departments, and the staff of the civil service. The Prime Minister also acts as the public face and voice of Her Majesty's government, both at home and abroad. Solely upon the advice of the Prime Minister, the sovereign exercises many statutory and prerogative powers, including high judicial, political, official and Church of England ecclesiastical appointments, the conferral of peerages, knighthoods, decorations and other honours. Although they may sometimes appear to be heavily under the influence of their aides, in reality the Prime Minister is in control. Constitutional background. The British system of government is based on an uncodified constitution, meaning that it is not set out in any single document. The British Constitution consists of many documents and, most importantly for the evolution of the office of Prime Minister, it is based on customs known as constitutional conventions that became accepted practice. In 1928, Prime Minister H. Asquith described this characteristic of the British Constitution in his memoirs. In this country we live under an unwritten constitution. It is true that we have on the statute book great instruments like Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and a Bill of Rights which define and secure many of our rights and privileges, but the great bulk of our constitutional liberties and our constitutional practices do not derive the validity and sanction from any bill which has received the formal assent of the King, Lords and Commons. They rest on usage, custom, convention, often of slow growth in their early stages, not always uniform, but which in the course of time received universal observance and respect. The relationships between the Prime Minister and the Sovereign, Parliament and Cabinet are defined largely by these unwritten conventions of the Constitution. Many of the Prime Minister's executive and legislative powers are actually royal prerogatives which are still formally vested in the Sovereign, who remains the head of state. Despite its growing dominance in the constitutional hierarchy, the premiership was given little formal recognition until the 20th century. The legal fiction was maintained that the sovereign still governed directly. The position was first mentioned in statute only in 1917, in the schedule of the Checkers of State Act. Increasingly during the 20th century, the office and role of Prime Minister featured in statute law and official documents. However, the Prime Minister's powers and relationships with other institutions still largely continue to derive from ancient royal prerogatives and historic and modern constitutional conventions. Prime Ministers continue to hold the position of First Lord of the Treasury and, since November 1968, that of Minister for the Civil Service, the latter giving them authority over the civil service. Under this arrangement, Britain might appear to have two executives, the Prime Minister and the Sovereign. The concept of the Crown resolves this paradox. The Crown symbolizes the state's authority to govern, to make laws and execute them, impose taxes and collect them, declare war and make peace. Before the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the sovereign exclusively wielded the powers of the Crown. Afterwards, Parliament gradually forced monarchs to assume a neutral political position. Parliament has effectively dispersed the powers of the Crown, entrusting its authority to responsible ministers, accountable for their policies and actions to Parliament, in particular the elected House of Commons. Although many of the sovereign's prerogative powers are still legally intact, constitutional conventions have removed the monarch from day-to-day governance, with ministers exercising the royal prerogatives, leaving the monarch in practice with three constitutional rights: to be kept informed, to advise, and to warn. Foundations of the office of Prime Minister. Revolutionary settlement. Because the premiership was not intentionally created, there is no exact date when its evolution began. A meaningful starting point, however, is 1688-9, when James II fled England and the Parliament of England confirmed William and Mary as joint constitutional monarchs, enacting legislation that limited their authority and that of the successors: the Bill of Rights, the Mutiny Bill, the Triennial Bill, the Treason Act, and the Act of Settlement, known collectively as the Revolutionary Settlement. These acts transformed the Constitution, shifting the balance of power from the sovereign to Parliament. They also provided the basis for the evolution of the office of Prime Minister, which did not exist at the time. Treasury Bench. The Revolutionary Settlement gave the Commons control over finances and legislation and changed the relationship between the executive and the legislature. For want of money, sovereigns had to summon Parliament annually and could no longer dissolve a prerogative without its advice and consent. Parliament became a permanent feature of political life. The veto fell into disuse because sovereigns feared that if they denied legislation, Parliament would deny them money. No sovereign has denied royal assent since Queen Anne vetoed the Scottish Militia Bill in 1708. Treasury officials and other department heads were drawn into Parliament, serving as liaisons between it and the sovereign. Ministers had to present the government's policies, and negotiate with members to gain the support of the majority. They had to explain the government's financial needs, suggest ways of meeting them, and give an account of how money had been spent. The sovereign's representatives attended Commons sessions so regularly that they were given reserved seats at the front, known as the Treasury Bench. This is the beginning of unity of powers. The sovereign's ministers became leading members of Parliament. Today the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and other senior members of the Cabinet sit on the Treasury Bench and present policies in much the same way ministers did late in the 17th century. After the Revolution, there was a constant threat that non-government members of Parliament would ruin the country's finances by proposing ill-considered money bills. Vying for control to avoid chaos, the Crown's ministers gained an advantage in 1706, when the Commons informally declared that this House will receive no petition for any sum of money relating to public service but what is recommended from the Crown. On the 11th of June 1713, this non-binding rule became Standing Order 66, that the Commons would not vote money for any purpose, except on a motion of a minister of the Crown. Standing Order 66 remains in effect today, essentially unchanged for 300 years. Empowering ministers with sole financial initiative had an immediate and lasting impact. Apart from achieving its intended purpose, to stabilize the budgetary process, it gave the Crown a leadership role in the Commons, and the Lord Treasurer assumed a leading position among ministers. The power of financial initiative was not, however, absolute. Only ministers might initiate money bills, but Parliament now reviewed and consented to them. Standing Order 66 therefore represents the beginnings of ministerial responsibility and accountability. The term Prime Minister appears at this time as an unofficial title for the leader of the government, usually the head of the Treasury. Jonathan Swift, for example, wrote in 1713 about those who are now commonly called Prime Minister among us, referring to Sidney Godolphin, 1st Earl of Godolphin, and Robert Harley, Queen Anne's Lord Treasurers and Chief Ministers. Since 1721, every head of the sovereign's government, with one exception in the 18th century and one in the 19th, has been First Lord of the Treasury. Beginnings of the Prime Minister's party leadership. Political parties first appeared during the exclusion crisis of 1678 to 1681. The Whigs, who believed in limited monarchy, wanted to exclude James Stuart from succeeding to the throne because he was a Catholic. The Tories, who believed in the divine right of kings, defended James' hereditary claim. These parties dominated British politics for over 150 years, with the Whigs evolving into the Liberal Party and the Tories into the Conservative. Even today, Conservatives are often called Tories. Political parties were not well organized or disciplined in the 17th century. They were more like factions with members drifting in and out, collaborating temporarily on issues when it was to their advantage, then disbanding when it was not. A major deterrent to the development of opposing parties was the idea that there could only be one King's Party, and to oppose it would be disloyal, or even treasonous. This idea lingered throughout the 18th century. Nevertheless, it became possible at the end of the 17th century to identify parliaments and ministries as being either Whig or Tory in composition. Cabinet. The modern Prime Minister is also the leader of the Cabinet, a convention of the Constitution. The modern Cabinet is a group of ministers who formulate policies. As the political heads of government departments, Cabinet ministers ensure that policies are carried out by permanent civil servants. Although the modern Prime Minister selects ministers, appointment still rests with the sovereign. With the Prime Minister as its leader, the Cabinet forms the executive branch of government. The term Cabinet first appears after the revolutionary settlement to describe those ministers who conferred privately with the sovereign. The growth of the Cabinet met with widespread complaint and opposition because its meetings were often held in secret and it excluded the ancient Privy Council from the sovereign's circle of advisers, reducing it to an honorary body. The early Cabinet, like that of today, included the Treasurer and other department heads who sat on the Treasury Bench. However, it might also include individuals who were not members of Parliament, such as household officers and members of the royal family. The exclusion of non-members of Parliament from the Cabinet was essential to the development of ministerial accountability and responsibility. Both William and Anne appointed and dismissed Cabinet members, attended meetings, made decisions, and followed up on actions. Relieving the sovereign of these responsibilities and gaining control over the Cabinet's composition was an essential part of evolution of the premiership. This process began after the Hanoverian succession, although George I attended cabinet meetings at first. After 1717 he withdrew because he did not speak fluent English and was bored with the discussions. George II occasionally presided at cabinet meetings, but his grandson, George III, is known to have attended only 2 during his 60-year reign. Thus, the convention that sovereigns do not attend cabinet meetings was established primarily through royal indifference to the everyday tasks of governance. The Prime Minister became responsible for calling meetings, presiding, taking notes, and reporting to the sovereign. These simple executive tasks naturally gave the Prime Minister ascendancy over his cabinet colleagues. Although the first 3 Hanoverians rarely attended cabinet meetings, they insisted on the prerogatives to appoint and dismiss ministers and to direct policy even if from outside the cabinet. It was not until late in the 18th century that prime ministers gained control over cabinet composition. One-party government. British governments are generally formed by one party. The Prime Minister and Cabinet are usually all members of the same political party, almost always the one that has a majority of seats in the House of Commons. Coalition governments and minority governments are relatively rare. One-party government, as this system is sometimes called, has been the general rule for almost 300 years. Early in his reign, William III preferred mixed ministries, consisting of both Tories and Whigs. William thought this composition would dilute the power of any one party and also give him the benefit of differing points of view. However, this approach did not work well because the members could not agree on a leader or on policies, and often worked at odds with each other. In 1697, William formed a homogeneous Whig ministry, known as the Junto. This government is often cited as the first true cabinet because its members were all Whigs, reflecting the majority composition of the Commons. Anne followed this pattern but preferred Tory cabinets. This approach worked well as long as Parliament was also predominantly Tory. However, in 1708, when the Whigs obtained a majority, Anne did not call on them to form a government, refusing to accept the idea that politicians could force themselves on her merely because the party had a majority. She never parted with an entire ministry or accepted an entirely new one regardless of the results of an election. Anne preferred to retain a minority government rather than be dictated to by Parliament. Consequently, her chief ministers Sidney Godolphin, 1st Earl of Godolphin, and Robert Harley, who were called Prime Minister by some, had difficulty executing policy in the face of a hostile parliament. William's and Anne's experiments with the political composition of the cabinet illustrated the strengths of one-party government and the weaknesses of coalition and minority governments. Nevertheless, it was not until the 1830s that the Constitutional Convention was established that the sovereign must select the Prime Minister from the party, whose views reflect those of the majority in Parliament. Since then, most ministries have reflected this one-party rule. Despite the one-party convention, prime ministers may still be called upon to lead either minority or coalition governments. A minority government may be formed as a result of a hung parliament, in which no single party commands a majority in the House of Commons after a general election of the death, resignation or defection of existing members. By convention, the serving prime minister is given the first opportunity to reach agreements that will allow them to survive a vote of confidence in the House and continue to govern. The last minority government was led by Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson for 8 months after the February 1974 general election produced a hung parliament. In the October 1974 general election, the Labour Party gained 18 seats, giving Wilson a majority of 3. A hung parliament may also lead to the formation of a coalition government in which 2 or more parties negotiate a joint programme to command a majority in the Commons. Coalitions have also been formed during times of national crisis such as war. Under such circumstances, the parties agree to temporarily set aside the political differences and to unite to face the national crisis. Coalitions are rare. Since 1721, there have been fewer than a dozen. When the general election of 2010 produced a hung parliament, the Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties agreed to form the first Cameron ministry, the first coalition in 70 years. The previous coalition in the UK before 2010 was led by Conservative Prime Minister Winston Churchill during most of the Second World War, from May 1940 to May 1945. Clement Attlee, the leader of the Labour Party, served as Deputy Prime Minister. After the general election of 2015, the nation returned to one-party government after the Tories won an outright majority. Treasury Commission. The Premiership is still largely a convention of the Constitution. Its legal authority is derived primarily from the fact that the Prime Minister is also First Lord of the Treasury. The connection of these two offices, one a convention, the other a legal office, began with the Hanoverian succession in 1714. When George I succeeded to the British throne in 1714, his German ministers advised him to leave the office of Lord High Treasurer vacant because those who had held it in recent years had grown overly powerful, in effect, replacing the sovereign as head of the government. They also feared that a Lord High Treasurer would undermine their own influence with the new king. They therefore suggested that he placed the office in commission, meaning that a committee of 5 ministers would perform its functions together. Theoretically, this dilution of authority would prevent any one of them from presuming to be the head of the government. The king agreed and created the Treasury Commission, consisting of the First Lord of the Treasury, the Second Lord, and 3 junior lords. No one has been appointed Lord High Treasurer since 1714. It has remained in commission for 300 years. The Treasury Commission ceased to meet late in the 18th century but has survived, albeit with very different functions. The First Lord of the Treasury is now the Prime Minister, the Second Lord is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the junior lords are government whips maintaining party discipline in the House of Commons. They no longer have any duties related to the Treasury, though when subordinate legislation requires the consent of the Treasury, it is still 2 of the junior lords who sign on its behalf.